Welcome, everybody. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum, and we're delighted to be able to have this kind of mini symposium tonight in two parts that celebrates the publication of this really extraordinarily beautiful and richly informative book on the Wrigley Building. And we have a contingent of the three of the four authors or contributors to the book, Tim Samuelson and Bill Zbaren, who is the photographer for the really gorgeous contemporary photography here. Let me see, also
Robert Sharoff.
and Robert Sharoff, who compiled and researched most of the material and wrote most of the chapters for the book. And because you've been collaborators on a number of projects before, book projects, I guess, this is a team that's very familiar with each other, very comfortable and discussing and collaborating their research. And the way that this book comes together, it's a little bit too big to give you a sampler of the really extraordinary photography, but also the great variety of historic photographs. And I think, Robert, you're going to talk a little bit about how you found these things. The kind of consumer or the commercial culture aspects of the Wrigley Building. All of these are themes that they'll be explicating with their images. And then we'll be discussing in the second part of the symposium, which comes after a short break, when the academic scholars of the skyscraper, Gail Fensky, who is the world's expert on the Woolworth building, and Thomas Leslie, who is a Chicagoan himself and has written 2 volumes on the history of the Chicago skyscraper, are going to have a kind of friendly tete-a-tete about the New Yorkness and the Chicago-ness of these buildings. And we'll ask the authors to chime in as well. But we thought we would kind of develop these themes, but also seriously explore some ideas about how these buildings, which are in so many ways very much the same, do represent the context of their cities. And so Gail is going to lead that off. Tom will chime in. And then we have another treat, a kind of dessert on top of the whole event, which is the author Don LePan, who has, his book is over there. I should hold it up again when I introduce the second half, a book on the skyscraper in the city, which happens to be the title of Gail's book as well. And it is mostly his own watercolor urban views of impressions of skyscrapers. So it seemed particularly appropriate that after we talk about the reception of these 2 buildings and their commercial culture and on the urban scene, that we have the artistic response of other people that become a part of the kind of continuing legacy of these buildings in the culture broadly, the artistic culture. So there are more than 100 slides that each could form at least a 5 or 10-minute discussion. But Tim and Bill and Robert are going to kind of do a little musical chairs where they jump up, recite, talk about things, maybe chime in or interrupt, but they will. The 3 of them will have a rehearsed pattern of explanation.
3 tenors.
Okay, so Robert, you're going to start.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Well, one thing I learned from putting this program together is that it's almost impossible to squeeze a 400-page book into a half-hour or 40-minute presentation. You have to leave out so much, like this. This was a movie made in 1959, starring Peter Graves and an actress known as Miss Cheesecake professionally, and involves atomically radiated grasshoppers attacking the Wrigley Building. Or how about this photo? What's going on here? This is a photo of Wrigley employees hooked up to a machine that is measuring their saliva levels while they chew gum. This was part of an experiment to see if chewing gum has medical benefits. It turns out it doesn't. There are a lot of stories like this in the book. We do explore the pop culture aspects of the book. But tonight we're going to talk about primarily how the book came to be, and the architecture as well. This book would not have happened without the participation of two people. One of them was Joanne Suedo, who is the current owner of the Wrigley Building. And the other person is this woman, Diane McFadden. When we began this project 4 years ago, it did not occur to me that I would be able to speak with someone who had actually known the architect of the Wrigley Building, Charles Beersman. Charles Beersman died back in 1946, almost 80 years ago, and at best, I thought maybe I'd find a grandchild or a great-grandchild. All I knew was that Beersman and his wife Beatrice had two children, a son, Jack, born in 1924, and a daughter, Diane, in 1928. I searched for obituaries and found one for Jack, but I kept looking for Diane, and after weeks spent stumbling around the internet, I found an address and a phone number in Stonington, Connecticut. And this is Diane McFadden. Her first words to me were, "How did you find me?" She sounded very old and raspy. She was 92 years old. I told her about the book and she got very excited. That photo is a photo of her on her 90th birthday. I realized she had been waiting for years to talk to somebody about her father, who had died when she was 18 and who she had adored. She told me she had saved everything she could, photos and paintings and drawings, and what I like to see them. And at this point, I got very excited. And the only problem was that this was during COVID, and none of us had been vaccinated, the three of us. And I said, well, we'll come out as soon as we get vaccinated. I thought this would be a month or so. And then she said, well, that's fine, but you better come soon because I'm not well. I have COPD. And for the next 3 weeks, she and I talked and exchanged emails almost every day. She had a really astounding memory for 92. I mean, how many people do you know who still remember going to the 1933 World's Fair? She did. And she also remembered very personal stuff about her father. I mean, how he would sit with her at the table after dinner and help her with her math homework, and how his favorite greeting was, "What's your new idea?" 3 weeks later, I stopped hearing from her, and then I received an email from her daughter, Dion DeMalie. Dion DeMalie is here tonight, right there. Dion? She is the granddaughter of Charles Beersman and the daughter of Diane McFadden. Diane died a few weeks later, and it's a genuinely odd thing. You get to know someone during the last few weeks of their very long life. It felt mystical to me at the time. The Wrigley Building is the product of two very different personalities. The first is Charles Beersman, and the second was William Wrigley. First of all, we're going to talk about Charles Beersman. This is a photo of him when he was in college, about age 19. Charles Beersman was born in San Francisco in 1888 to a family of saloon keepers. His father was an itinerant saloon keeper who had trouble holding a job. The family moved around continually. During his childhood, Charles Beersman lived in over 11 different apartments. I mean, we actually have all the addresses. Architecture was changing in the 1890s and a new style was coming in. And that was, of course, Beaux-Arts. A movement that actually began in Chicago with this man, Daniel Burnham, and the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. This is a photo of the administration building at the 1893 exposition, which was designed by Richard Morris Hunt. Beaux-Arts architecture took its stylistic cues from the Renaissance, added steel frames, floating foundations and elevators, and the result was a style that would dominate American architecture for the next 40 years. The most spectacular Beaux-Arts building in San Francisco was this building, the Ferry Building, which was completed in 1898. The building took 6 years to build. Charles Beersman walked by it almost every day of his childhood. The highlight, of course, is the clock tower, which is modeled on the Giralda Tower, a 12th century bell tower in Seville, Spain. In the 1900s, Charles Beersman attended the Wilmerding School, which was a trade school for underprivileged kids, and where he took drafting classes and majored in electrical engineering. And a major part of electrical engineering in those years was about lighting. So already two elements of the Wrigley Building have fallen into place, the clock tower and the exterior lighting. Beersman's big break as an architect, I always think, was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. It happened just before dawn on April 6th, and it leveled most of downtown San Francisco, including the apartment Beersman was living in. Here's a postcard of San Francisco. I'm sorry about that. That's the Giralda Tower in Seville, Spain.
Right, which the tower is modeled on.
Keep clicking. All right, here's San Francisco, just on the eve of the 1906 earthquake. And here is a photo of San Francisco after the earthquake. The city began rebuilding at a furious rate, and there was a shortage of architectural draftsmen. And within months, Charles Beersman was hired by the firm of Morgan and Hoover. Nobody really remembers Hoover today, but Morgan was Julia Morgan, which she is. Julia Morgan was the first woman to graduate from the School of the Beaux-Arts in Paris, and also the founder of one of the first woman-owned architecture firms in the United States. Morgan went on to have an astounding career, during which she designed more than 700 buildings, primarily in California, and many for the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. Over the next 2 years, she became Beersman's mentor, and here's an example of the work he did for her. He was actually an excellent draftsman. In 1910, she pulled strings and paid his tuition to get him into the architectural program at the University of Pennsylvania, which was headed by the her School of Beaux-Arts classmate, the French architect Paul Craig. Beaux-Arts was more than a style. It was also a method, a way of working, a way of thinking about architecture. And the key was what was known as the esquisse, or a freehand sketch. Oh, that's a photo of the architecture school at the University of Pennsylvania in 1910.
There's Paul Craig.
There's Paul Craig. You will notice it was certainly an all-male environment at that point. Do we have this SKC? Where is it? Oh, this is one of his student drawings, actually, an SKC. And you can see immediately his great talent as a draftsman and as an ornamentalist. Beersman graduated 2 years later and immediately began work, the first of 3 jobs he would have in New York over the next 5 years. And he was also awarded I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Lebrun Traveling Scholarship, which is still around and is administered by New York AIA, for a 3-month sketching tour of Italy. And here are the watercolors he completed during his sketching tour. And again, you see his great talent for thinking on his feet, for capturing the moment. And the trip also changed his self-image. Up until then, when he filled out forms or was asked what he did, he said he was a draftsman. And after he got back from Italy, he referred to himself as an artist. Beersman's 3 jobs in New York were with James Gamble Rogers, John Russell Pope, and Tracy and Swartout, with the last one being the most important. Tracy and Swartout was Everett Tracy, a graduate of the School of the Beaux-Arts who began his career as a draftsman for McKim, Mead and White. After Julia Morgan, Everett Tracy was Beersman's most important mentor. Among the buildings Beersman designed during the 3 years he worked for Tracy and Swartout were the Astor Market. And here's a photo of the Astor Market, which was commissioned by the millionaire developer Vincent Astor and was really New York's first gourmet supermarket. It was 200,000 square feet, was located at the corner of Broadway and 95th Street, and was modeled on public markets in Milan and Florence. The market cost $1 million to construct and opened in 1915, and unfortunately, it closed 2 years later. And the other remarkable work he designed in this period was the Mary Baker Memorial, which was completed in 1917. It's in Boston's Mount Auburn Cemetery, and it's this flawless classical monument, 15-foot columns and carved stone ornamentation. You can see there that is right out of Julia Morgan's playbook. Beersman himself claimed it in interviews. I mean, it's officially attributed to Swartout, but when I look at it, I see Beersman again. He claimed it in bios. It's mentioned in his obituaries. And obviously you can't be sure about anything, but this seems to be his first great building. In 1917, Beersman married Beatrice Brophy. There she is, a stenographer from New Brunswick, New Jersey. And just as both sides of Beersman's family were German immigrant shopkeepers, her family were Russian immigrant. They were also shopkeepers. How they met is unknown. He was 29 and she was 24. They honeymooned in California, stopping first in Los Angeles, where Beersman examined Julia Morgan's most recent building for William Randolph Hearst, the Los Angeles Examiner building. You can see it as kind of a mission-style building on the outside. Inside, however, here we see Morgan's style at its boldest and most expressive. Morgan was unique in her interpretation of the Beaux-Arts, left room for arts and crafts elements and ornamentation based on the flora and fauna of Southern California, Northern California. Yeah.
This is like, we were on this project for so long, we kept saying, where did the terracotta, this white Wrigley, this odd building come from? And 2.5 years or 2 years into it, we went to visit this, and when we walked into the lobby, we were like, oh my God, it's the Wrigley Building inside out. And so Julia clearly had a great sense of humor and was playful, and so was Charles, as we'll see another images coming up. But in the center there, in that box, that's her private elevator, and only he was allowed to use it. So she builds a little stage with little stairs, and everybody else had to use the stairs, walk up. But he was the only one when he did come to the office. And over time, the story plays out for me as the photographer and the iconology. There's a detail of it. But then right over the door is this, which I found late. I was shooting a lot of details and things. And the more I looked at it, I finally looked it up. And I started looking into the language of the Beaux-Arts and what these cartouches represent, which are completely embedded into the Wrigley Building. And so in a lot of interpretations of the language of the Beaux-Arts, it's 2 angels with a bear. The bear, which is a California symbol as well, but represents power. And the angels represent the bridge between heaven and earth and the power. So she's kind of poking fun at him at the same time. And then here are more details of it. So you can see the deep, deep carving. This is marble and plaster.
That one especially.
That it's
very
so,
much
it's
the
so
original.
rich. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
In 1919, Beersman received a job offer from Graham Anderson Probst and White in Chicago that would change his life. Graham Anderson was Daniel Burnham's successor firm, and its chief designer was Pierce Anderson. There was a painting of him. And like all of Beersman's employers, he was a graduate of the School of the Beaux-Arts. Now we'll talk a little bit about William Wrigley. In 1919, William Wrigley Jr. had just turned 58. There he is. That photo just sums him up. Wow. He was at the peak of his career. Born in Philadelphia, he moved to Chicago in 1891 to open a sales office for his family's soap company. When that didn't work, he switched to selling baking powder. And when that didn't work, he began offering 2 packages of chewing gum with every can of baking powder, and that worked. Within a year, that really worked. Within a year, soap and baking powder were off the track, and Wrigley was in the gum business. And what I find interesting about Wrigley's career is that the actual product, chewing gum, it was almost beside the point. Chewing gum is made from tree gum and sugar and a little bit of flavoring. It's not hard to make. Even Wrigley said anybody could do it. It's also not a staple. Nobody needs gum. They have to want it. And Wrigley's true genius was knowing how to create the want. And the way he did it was through advertising. In many ways, Wrigley had 1 foot in the 19th century and 1 foot in the 20th. His real heroes are people like Buffalo Bill or P.T. Barnum. His strategy was to tell them quick, tell them often. In the 1920s, billboards were the primary form of consumer advertising. Wrigley had tens of thousands of billboards from coast to coast. The most spectacular one was this one, which a 7-story light-up extravaganza in Times Square, designed by Oscar Good, who was known as the Botticelli of Broadway. But this was the tip of the iceberg. Wrigley's billboards blanketed the country. And here's 2 or 3 typical ones from that period. As you can see, the art on these boards was fairly primitive. The one enduring motif was the spearman. But again, the boards made up in quantity what they lacked in sophistication. And here's one of here's another one. Okay. Keep going. That one. I love it.
This one's wild. And here it is, and here it is. You can see the scale of these things. Look at the scale of that. Here, go back.
These were along a highway in Massachusetts.
He was fearless.
By the 1920s, the Wrigley Company was a top 5 national advertiser. The only companies that were bigger were General Motors, American Tobacco, Coca-Cola, and Procter & Gamble. But as successful as it was, the company still lacked a major corporate presence in Chicago. Wrigley occupied a number of buildings in Chicago in the early 1900s, but they were all rental buildings of no particular description. In 1919, at the urging of Mayor William Thompson, who was one of the most corrupt mayors in Chicago history, but who Wrigley was pretty good friends with, Wrigley began scouting sites for a new building. He knew what he wanted, and he wanted a site and a building that really would be the equivalent of his Times Square billboard. He found what he wanted on Michigan Avenue, which was then under construction. Michigan Avenue really was brand new then. Daniel Burnham had proposed it in his 1909 plan of Chicago. And this is a rendering from the 1909 plan of Chicago of Michigan Avenue. And as you see, it's modeled on the Champs-Élysées, but the Wrigley Building today is just across the river on the left side. The site was very challenging. Here is a site plan. As you can see, it's completely irregular, no right angles. I mean, that one corner narrows to 5 feet. I mean, and he's also going to do a major tower. Again, 10,000 square feet. Many years later, William Wrigley's son, Philip Wrigley, described it as cockeyed all the way around. But it fronted on a vast new plaza, and whatever was built there would be visible for miles. Beersman was 31 when he began designing what would be his most famous building. Here he is in the early 1920s, about the time he designed the Wrigley Building, and he's holding his infant son Jack there. Many years later, Beersman would tell his daughter that William Wrigley was his favorite client. And it's really easy to see why. Wrigley's approach to architecture was identical to his approach to advertising. Go big and stand out, make people notice you. And for Beersman, it was an open-ended invitation to just, dig deep into his imagination and create something amazing. Like all Beaux-Arts architects, Beersman began with history. 2 buildings in particular played important roles in his thinking. The first is the Giralda Tower, which he first saw at the Ferry Building in San Francisco. And the second is Chateau Chambord in France's Loire Valley. It's unknown if Beersman ever saw any one of these, but he obviously knew the Ferry Building, and Chambord was an icon of the Renaissance, and famous for its skyline of gables and pediments and its incredibly lavish ornamentation, as you can see there. Chambord was built by King Francis I in the 15th century, who took as his emblem the mythological salamander, a beast that could live in fire. Chambord, this is one of them, is just tattooed with salamanders everywhere, on every wall, on every tapestry. There's over 400 of them. And the Beersman, so with Beersman, the Wrigley Building is also tattooed with salamanders. The Wrigley Building's facade is made up of 375,000 individual tiles of terracotta, all of which were molded and cast at Northwestern Terracotta's Northside factory. The building broke ground in early 1920 and was completed in April of 1921. The total cost was $3.8 million, and equivalent today to about $80 million. What have we got there? There it is. That's a construction shot.
That's right. There it is, breaking ground.
Yeah, this is the Michigan Avenue Bridge, and you see just on the other side. And this is actually an early blueprint of a lighting scheme for the building. So you can see that at one time they planned on putting searchlights on a building across the river and shining them on the building. Oh.
And there it is.
There it is, fully illuminated. Okay, all right.
And there it is. Oh, the tower.
Oh, the tower. At night, the building and the beacon, the clock, the top of the clock tower was visible for 20 miles. And from day one, the Wrigley Building was a total wow and success in Chicago. The Chicago Tribune wrote, "Well may the famous leaning tower of Pisa totter and tremble. Its supremacy in the tower line is menaced, if not destroyed, by the Wrigley Tower of Chicago." A year after its completion, the Tribune asked readers to name the 7 wonders of the world, and the Wrigley ranked between the pyramids of Egypt and the Panama Canal. And so successful was the building, it was fully leased when it opened. Wrigley immediately began making plans for a second tower. Now, Bill is going to talk a little bit about terracotta, which is really one of the most extraordinary aspects of the building.
So I'm not quite as linear as Robert, although we're both. So here's the building completed at the very end with both towers up. But I'm going to jump back to this because of the iconology of the Beaux-Arts and Wrigley using the spearman repeatedly in all his ads to drive home this imagery of gum. So Beersman, the architect, was a perfect match for Wrigley. Louder. And here's the building. It's a modern building. This is the building when it's completed. And look where it's built. It's in the middle of a factory zone across the river with the first building. And Wrigley lets Beersman build a white porcelain building in the most filthy section of the city. I mean, it was just had to be scrubbed 4 times a year with it turned black. So there's all these things that start playing to me, taking pictures, going, what is going on? And so I want to jump back, and you guys are probably more up to it than some of our audience on architecture, but how the building came about. So this is a 15th century building in Florence that's load bearing. And the building, it's all stacked with wood and stone, and it's a classical language, and it's like a classical column with a base, a center, and a capital, a reveal, but also emotionally, it's weighted at the base to give you the information of it's not a blob sitting there. He defines the door in the center, and on that heavy base, he puts whoever did this, put those small windows to emotionally release the weight of all these materials. Then horizontal bands going up, and then it ends with the cornice going up into the sky. So this is a load-bearing building. Now we're going to jump, and this is 15th century. Then I'm going to jump now to 1891. I know it's a long time, but this is Louis Sullivan's Wainwright building. And steel had been introduced. This is 1891. Steel came in the 80s. There was a lot of steel going up all over the place like crazy, but there was no defined skyscraper. And it's debatable, but most of the books will say this finally defined the vertical modern skyscraper in a classical language. So there it is with the base. And in this case, the little windows help. The doors were very well defined. Then there's the column, the vert going up. And it's all those vertical lines that are important with the horizontals. And then it reveals the end, the capital, with this beautiful cornice that goes into the sky. And here's a detail of those lines. Because the building, now we have steel. Before we had weight loading buildings, and they had to deal with heaviness. And now we have steel that can go vertical. But up until this building, a pure definition of not stacking like a wedding cake hadn't really been worked out yet. So this kind of goes there. And then here's a facade of the Wrigley. And now that's 1891. Now we're 1921, and steel's more sophisticated, so he can move it in and out. It doesn't have to just be a bird cage or a box. And then there's the building. And what's so important here is that Beersman defines that center core above the door, which you'll see next, going all the way up to that clock tower and all those vertical lines. And how the building works in and out with those vertical lines is they're set at different depths. So the sun goes over it, it undulates all day, but that center core stays strong. So your mind emotionally, your feeling of weight is always going up into the sky. And here it is from the south view, and it's coming out of the water, it's coming out of the river. And it's projecting up Michigan Avenue. And there's the classical base with the windows breaking the weight. There's the center vertical column, and then there's the capital. And here's your door, rarely defined, 2-story door, 2.5, 3, and fit for a king like Wrigley. And all the detailing. And you don't just walk through a block. You start to have these experiences. And this is looking up to that clock tower, that center core. And then this is where things kind of get wonky because you can't see what you think is just texture, but actually there's iconic sculpture, which we're going to go into. So to the right and the left, these are these dancing women, and you can barely make these out when you're standing there. So this is down low, and everything in the language of the Beaux-Arts represents something. So these women dancing represent the transformation of time and motion. And then we go up and there are these urns with flames and they represent divine power. And then over the door, he does this severe 4 columns that are holding up that vertical center. And at top of those are falcons. And those falcons represent strength. They're holding up that visual, emotional push of materials. Then we go up further. And now we're at the 13th floor, and wrapping around the whole building are these eagles with their wings spread. And above those eagles, the next floor is Wrigley's personal office. So those eagles represent divine, all-seeing power. So Beersman's having fun like Julia did with Hearst. And then to have more fun, because the eagles are holding up Wrigley's office, there's this cartouche, which is right above it. And I do a detail of that. And it's an angel holding 2 apes from monkeys. And the angels represent all divine same power. And the monkeys are a play between virtue, folly, and vice. So there's these little messages, these stories being told out, not just for texture, but of these little messages being sent out. But at the same time, no one could ever see this. And if you Google the Wrigley Building, you can't find a picture of this. It's very crazy. And there was nothing around it, as you saw. And even from the picture of the warehouses, and even now from buildings around it, you can barely make this out. Then we go up further. He finishes it with the Capitol with a crown, and there's seashells, and the seashells represent love and money, and the floor ornamentation represents harmony. So there's more to it than just texture. And then we get to the top, the flat, and he does these 2 buildings, represents buildings on the left and the right, which look like buttresses that give you an emotional release. You just don't have the tower shooting out of a flat line. I called them the temples. And then on the sides of the temples, well, here's the nose that's 5 feet wide. Isn't that remarkable? It's like the Flatiron. And he saw the Flatiron. He was here watching it being built. So here's the side of the temples. And no one ever saw this. And I'm shooting with long lenses and hanging on rooftops and looking at things. And in there's a salamander. There's hundreds of salamanders. And I come in closer, there's your salamander, all divine. And here's another detail of it. And again, there are the cartouches, and there's the salamander with the crown, which is the power to withstand being conquered. There's fish, eagles, angels, lions, floral patterns. That all is prosperity, growth, courage, wisdom, enlightenment, royalty. I mean, this is really a wild story being told out here. And then we go up. Here's another one of the salamanders. And here's a big overall detail of one of the temple's sides. And then we go up to the clock tower. And as that rises up, there's the tower. And again, you're looking at this from the ground, you're looking at it from across, but when you come in, there's a little rosette, and there's little urns, and all this is like telling the story of, again, there are architectural elements, but the rosette is power and prosperity. And then there's at the very top, the only round section of the building is this cupola, which I think is absolutely charming. To release into the heavens. And at the very top is the spire, and it's sprouting little leaves. So there's this whole energy and growth. So the building is this man-made kind of work of art, not just architecturally, but emotionally releasing from the ground and going up into the sky. And here's the tower in context then with the buildings today, with the Tribune Tower on the left. And then he gets commissioned to do the second tower a year later. And this one, they're similar in the center, which we'll call the column. But what always got to me was the space between, because everything's cattywampus and turning and twisting and not square. And I shot this over the years, and it was that space between that always fascinated me. And the more I got into the iconology, and the imagery, I started doing more research and thinking about something that Robert had found out in his research, that when Charles Beersman was working for Julia Morgan, and he was very young. He got hired at 19. He also took vocal training lessons. So he studied opera. And he also was written up in the paper of having a good voice and performing. So he knew Verdi, Mozart. He understood opera. So then I started thinking about the space and the opera. So I went back and looked at 15th century opera drawings. This is a drawing by someone named Tortellini, who was a famous Italian opera drawer, set designer. And then that made my leap to this, which is this passage, this arcade between the two buildings. Now I'm making this up, but this is how I'm translating it from with the camera. And what I'm seeing is he's referencing a proscenium arch for people, human people. 10,000 people or more a day just in front of that arch walk through or under it. And it's a performance space. And here's a detail of it to show how he scaled it with the base, with the stone to the terracotta, with somebody walking through. So it's like an opera set, La Boheme, the curtain opens up and you're like, whoa, because of the scale. It's completely emotional. And then these are details of the arcade with a cove ceiling, which is very complicated. And here it is again. You can see all the different weaving of pattern that he's putting together. And here's one more of the detail of the arcade. And this is it looking out. Then this is what I call backstage, looking back out from the whole thing, out onto Michigan Avenue, looking east. And then this is the doorway to the North Tower. And it's similar to the South original tower, but a little different. It's a little bit more Eastern influence. And both entrances have, as you can see here, this cartouche that goes up and over the door. And the more I looked at that, the more I was like saying, now, what's that going to mean? And I can find my notes to get there. I will play it out. Okay, so in that cartouche are all these iconology. There's the cornucopia, there's the bird with the wings spread, there's head of a king, there's floral. And all of this says prosperity, abundance. This all represents freedom, aspiration, divine right to rule, harmony between life and earth, the cycle of life, death, rebirth. And he's telling people, whether they know it or not, he's giving them a moral message as they come to work every day. They're passing this other language. And this is above the door. This is what you walk under. The pagoda with the flame, which is divine power, the dragons for fearlessness, the floral harmony between life and death, the devil, your choice between good and evil, and the birds for imagination. So it's this wonderful story that I didn't know when I started to shoot a building architecturally. I never shot anything that had this kind of information embedded in it. And then he finishes the building with a crown, a spectacular crown that I call a pilot house, which I'll show you later. And on the back, this is the smokestack, which is completely glamorous, and a water tank underneath it. And here's a detail of the colonnade. And then that's the crown, which I call the pilot house, because it feels like a ship, the way it's on an angle driving north up Michigan Avenue. So that's kind of my artistic interpretation of this structure.
The 1920s were Charles Beersman's golden age, during which he designed numerous buildings, including the Strauss Building on Michigan Avenue, the Continental Bank Building on LaSalle Street, and the Terminal Tower train station in Cleveland, which actually, if you have actually been to Cleveland and seen this, it is a pretty amazing train station. When it was finished, it was the second tallest building in the world after the Woolworth Building. Beersman's last major project was a diorama for the 1933 Century of Progress exposition. Here is a depiction of it. The Tribune described it as, quote, the work of a man of genius. It had a budget of $60,000, the equivalent of $1 million today, and involved the talents of over 100 artists, engineers, and sculptors. Beersman and his generation represented the final flowering of the Beaux-Arts movement in the United States, which began with Daniel Burnham and the 1893 Columbian Exposition, and ultimately resulted in the creation of some of the country's most important and beloved landmarks, so many of which are here in New York. In 1932, William Wrigley died and was succeeded by his son, Philip Wrigley. This is a photo of him, actually, the morning after his father died. Several weeks later, Philip held a press conference and announced, "We have made no changes and will make none. I and no one else can ever hope to fill my father's shoes." And that's pretty much how it played out for the Wrigley Company for the next half century. The one thing Philip did do was upgrade the advertising by hiring, there's the Wrigley Building, 1920. There they are. By hiring these guys. This is Otis and Dorothy Shepherd.
Are they cool?
They're like the coolest people in the world. Yeah. The Shepherds, they were both from California. He was a Bauhaus influenced graphic designer, and she was an artist and a painter in a style that freely referenced Picasso and Matisse and Modigliani. And the Shepherds came on board in the early 1930s and stayed until the 1960s. And they introduced a new note of glamour and sophistication to Wrigley's advertising. I mean, again, this is where we're starting from. Click. And this is where the Shepherds took them. In 1937, Dorothy Shepherd designed Wrigley's latest Times Square billboard.
Let's go for these were several of the double mint twin.
Yes, they also invented the double mint twins.
Right.
Yes.
Like an incredible shift.
Yes.
into the current present. Yes.
And now we come to Dorothy's Times Square billboard. It cost $1 million and was the largest neon installation in the world. Now Tim is going to talk a little bit about some of the pop cultural aspects of the building.
So I leave it to Bill and Robert to talk about French cathedrals and ornaments and classic design. And I wind up doing in these kind of presentations and in this book, it's like the sports guy doing the color commentary, the little footnotes and little curious stories about the Wrigley Building. And so there are little vignettes that are spaced throughout the book, which I was able to do and pick up little topics that were about popular culture and aspects that aren't normally talked about. And one of the things that I think everyone knows about the Wrigley Building is it has a clock. Wrigley was very adamant about having a building that you would notice. And when you notice it, you would notice it as Wrigley's building. You look at it, you think Wrigley. Also, the idea of public timepieces still in the 1920s is a way of defining space. There weren't lots of wristwatch as a way to tell what time it was. And so buildings that had a clock on them actually had a very strong identity. And this became quickly known as Mr. Wrigley's clock, actually for better or for worse, as we are going to see. And every time you look at it, and what time is it, you think Wrigley. It's advertising it just the way it should. Now, there's a little bit of a problem with the clock from the beginning, in that the building opens in the spring of 1921, and it didn't have any hands for a long time. So it sat in this very prominent location. They're very proud of this building, and they're writing about it. And here are these giant clocks, 20 feet in diameter, with no hands. Now, the Chicago Tribune was across the street. They had their newspaper offices in a little building across the way. They hadn't built the Tribune Tower yet. And the reporters just had lots of fun, making fun of the fact about this no hands. It was even proposed that a statue of Venus de Milo should be put on the top of the building. Venus de Milo of no arms and no hands. And then finally, it even made the front page of the newspapers. The Wrigley clock to have its hands at last in time for the 4th of July. And then proud of it, Wrigley climbs up to the roof and poses with the two hands. I actually have a set of these extra hands, and they're made out of cedar. And our hand is 7 feet, and the minute hand is 11 feet. But they're redwood and they're tapered, and they're actually fairly lightweight. You can actually hold them up. But anyway, clock gets its hands finally, it becomes front page news. Now, one of the problems with the Wrigley Building is in building it, there were a lot of things they did that were to represent the newest in technologies that were available for this new type of building. And it had a clock, but there weren't many places that supplied the mechanisms for tower clocks. And probably the most prominent was the E. Howard Clock Company of Boston, Massachusetts. They probably, if you see old courthouses and churches, there's a good chance that the movement up there is an old wound up E. Howard clock. So this is what was specified to power the Wrigley, this giant Wrigley clock. Unfortunately, they really hadn't changed the design since about 1880. And if you take, this is the actual Wrigley clock. In fact, it is now in part of a museum devoted to tower clocks. And you can see it has decorative pinstriping, just like some old carriage that you would see in the late 19th century. So transposed up into the tower of the Wrigley Building to tell the time, it not only couldn't tell the time, but the different clock faces would tell different times. It got to be even a bigger joke in the newspapers about this giant clock that didn't work. The reporter, the running joke in the Chicago Tribune was if a reporter missed their deadline, they blamed it because they were following the time on the Wrigley clock across the way. So it was a real problem. Now, actually, the clock movements were changed over time, and now it's the little mechanisms on each hand getting signals from space and satellites to keep them relatively in good shape. Here's even a poem that was written about the Wrigley clock. It goes, hickory dickory dock, a curse on the Wrigley clock. Are its works drawn sticky with chewing gum? Can it be that in winter its hands are numb? They roll o'er the face with a gesture beery, an aimless wandering, embarrassed and weary. Speeds and it lags till it drives us frantic. We can't keep up with its whimsy and antic. Oh, Mr. Wrigley, please fix your clock that goes hickory dickory dock. This is the kind of thing that showed up all the time in the papers. It was good pressing. Now, kind of an interesting thing that is in the stories of urban legends and popular culture is that there is the famous 1923 comedy. One of the kind of the landmarks of silent film comedy was Harold Lloyd in a movie called Safety Last, and where he is seen hanging from a clock in a building. Now, you can go online and you will, and you put Wrigley clock and Harold Lloyd, you will find reference after reference saying that this was filmed on the Wrigley Building clock. Well, of course it's not. That is not a 20-foot clock face. That is not an 11-foot hand. It's actually a building in California. It's not a terracotta building, but people seem to kind of want to believe that that's where that was filmed from. But it's kind of interesting that for all the stories that are urban legends and stories that are bunk, there is often a degree of truth behind them. So Safety Last was going to be premiered, and Harold Lloyd was going to come to Chicago. The press agents in Hollywood come up with an idea that they would hoist Harold Lloyd in a bucket chair up to the top of the Wrigley Building with a bottle of champagne, which he would smash against the clock, christening it Big Bill, maybe after Big Bill Thompson or maybe after Wrigley himself. Unfortunately, they didn't bother to tell Harold Lloyd about this. So he comes to, they put it in the paper that this is going to happen at a certain time. Harold Lloyd comes to town and they kind of tell him, well, hey, guess what we've got for you to do when you come here? Well, take me to see that clock. Takes a look at it and says, no way, brethren, and didn't show up. People gathered to see Harold Lloyd smash this bottle of champagne. He didn't show up. They had to save face and say that the insurance companies filed an injunction against the possible loss of one of their major stars by falling off the Wrigley Building, that he wasn't able to appear. So there is a little bit of truth to that story. Even the thing about the Wrigley Building clock is, of course, the building is terracotta, and it has a finish that is like a dinner plate, and you could wash the building. The atmosphere was filthy in Chicago. They would periodically wash the building. In fact, it became part of the publicity itself to wash the building, kind of like you'd wash a dinner plate. In fact, you would have to stop the clock, and they would put an ad, a little story in the paper to tell you that the clock is not going to run because it's possible that the moving hands could sweep the workmen right off of their scaffold. It's all good publicity. It's all good promotional showbiz, pure Wrigley style. Also, the building was often used for photo trickery to remind people when it was time to change to daylight savings time and whatnot. You know, somebody would stand, they do the right perspective, and it looks like someone's changing the time. This was used over and over again. Now, another part of this story, this building, so you think of this building as this very building with really important historical imagery and a dignity to it, but there also was a communication aspect to it. One of the first radio stations, actually, just to show you how this worked, William Wrigley, he was kind of a sportsman guy, you know, and he was kind of open to anything. And there were two guys who were amateur enthusiasts for radio in the early 1920s. They had home radio set with a little antenna trying to pick up out-of-town signals. They were from influential families, and they knew Wrigley. And they somehow talked Wrigley and say, well, why don't we put our little radio station up in the tower of the Wrigley, and the whole building will serve as our antenna. And so this went on, and there were actually several radio stations that broadcast out of the Wrigley Building for many years. And there were different studios that broadcast soap operas. Many famous in radio history came out of the building. But there also was Studio 12. And Studio 12 was different in that it was set up for making phonograph records under the Columbia label. People don't talk about it that much. You hear about the big recording studios out in LA or in Nashville, but especially in the time before Nashville was Nashville, Chicago being a great hub for railroads, this was a place where many of the country artists would come to record as an easy way to get. And one of the great records that was in 1946 was Blue Moon of Kentucky, recorded in 1946. And this
Bravo!
is, you bet, Chicago being the birthplace of popularizing bluegrass. And not only Chicago, where you wouldn't expect it, but in the Wrigley Building. And here's the band. They were gathered there in the building and made that seminal recording. The Carter family recorded many of their records in there. Roy Acuff recorded in there. Gene Autry recorded in there. In jazz, Benny Goodman recorded in there. And it's quite a famous studio. Certainly also Chicago is known as the center of the blues. Many of the great blues musicians of Chicago wound up recording in the Wrigley studio. And here's Memphis Minnie and Me and My Chauffeur. Oh, Mr. Chauffeur, take me for a ride downtown. Recorded right there in 1941 in the Wrigley Building. I actually will take people who are historians of music and recording on tours of historic recording sites in the city. And I take them to the site of Studio 12. It was on the second floor of the North Tower. It is now a 2-story high Walgreens.
Oh.
You go to the adult diapers department and you are standing right in the site of Studio 12 where all of these historical recordings were made. Now, the great Studio 12 story that I like best of all, Benny Goodman, another good Chicago guy, but grew up, nurtured in Chicago, but like many Chicagoans that get successful, they go out of town, they go to New York. Fine, let them go, because you got new people coming in Chicago that are going to take their place. But anyway, good for Benny Goodman. So now he's a New Yorker, his band's performing in Chicago at a hotel. And it was decided that he should make some recordings at the Wrigley studio as long as he's in town. And so goes to the studio, and his longtime vocalist, Helen Forrest, had quit. So he found a new vocalist, and he was very excited about this new vocalist. He's going to try her out on this new session. The band shows up to Studio 12 in the Wrigley Building. And who is there on a visit but the record producer, John Hammond? He's really famous in recording history for discovering talent and really quite a major figure in himself. But Goodman and Hammond didn't like each other very much. And they're rehearsing for the piece, the session. And John Hammond listens to the new vocalist and he says, "Don't hire her. She's no good. She can't sing." Now, I think Benny Goodman, if you know, he probably gave him the old double and whatnot, went ahead with the recording session, and such became the first ever recording of Peggy Lee. So that's just some of the quirky stories that there are. They're all throughout the book. Take it away, Bill and Robert.
We're going to jump ahead now to the early 2000s. The Wrigley Company is experiencing growing pains at a time when candy and snack food companies are consolidating and turning themselves into conglomerates. The Wrigley Company was still going it alone, with brands like Spearmint and Juicy Fruit, which had been introduced over a century ago. And the building was showing its age. The building had sat out the tech revolution. Internet coverage in the building was very spotty. You couldn't do video. And the vacancy rate started climbing and eventually reached 60%. In 2008, the Wrigleys called it a day. When the Marsh Company offered them $23 billion for the company, they accepted instantly. And the building went along as part of the deal, but with the understanding that it would be sold, which it was, to BBT Capital, which is a venture capital firm. And they undertook an $82 million top to bottom renovation that included replacing the building's 2,000 windows and 375,000 terracotta blocks. This is a diagram showing the condition of the clock tower. I mean, the different colors denote blocks that needed to be replaced, blocks that were okay, blocks that needed to be repaired. You can see it needed extensive work. And inside, well, we're not going to talk too much about the inside, actually, because above the first floor, they did a complete gut. In the lobby, well, they didn't.
We're going to show some details of the lobby. There's there now.
Details of the lobby. These are the authentic details.
These are Charles Beersman's.
Yeah, these were designed by Charles Beersman.
So on the clock at the bottom is a W for Wrigley.
Yes.
Which shows up at the. And then here are the elevator doors. It's exquisite. And then over the door, here's our salamander.
Salamanders there. Then in 2018, the building began a new life after it was purchased by Bill Mansueto. There's Joe.
That's our guy.
The happiest billionaire. A century ago, the Wrigley Building pioneered the creation of Michigan Avenue, fulfilling Daniel Burnham's dream of a street that would rival Paris's Champs-Élysées. And the Wrigley Building itself today is fully leased, they tell me. Actually, a number of architecture firms are in there. The largest tenant these days is Perkins and Will. And it's always been the most famous building in Chicago. I mean, it's one of the few buildings where you get into a taxi and say, you don't have to give an address, you just say, take me to the Wrigley Building, and you'll get there. And another gauge of Wrigley's fame is, well, not that.
Well,
oh, this is a great postcard, actually, from 1940s.
I had to put this in. I love this postcard. But a really great fame is no building in Chicago has had this many knick-knack paddywhack souvenirs. And these weren't made by Wrigley. he was so brilliant in his marketing. He builds a building, doesn't put his name on it, does have the clock to play with, but these are all souvenirs that were in little gift shops and little street vendors. And so over the years, we started collecting these slowly, first kind of laughing at them, but then suddenly realized, oh my God, no other building has had this many.
That's sort of astounding.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone can make gum, William Wrigley said. The trick is to sell it. Chicago was the ultimate mercantile city, and the Wrigley Building was conceived as a tribute to salesmanship. But it's also a place where a group of artists and craftspeople came together to create a work of staggering beauty and complexity. Recently, Bill and I were watching Ken Burns's documentary on the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, which I guess was his first big documentary. The documentary ends with a quote by the architect Louis Kahn that I think applies perfectly to the Wrigley Building, and here it is. The creation of art is not the fulfillment of a need, but the creation of a need. The world never needed Beethoven's Fifth Symphony until he created it, and now we could not live without it. Thank you.
All right, now for part two. So New York response, and we have a wonderful lineup of scholars and of an academic publisher, Don LePan, who is also an artist, and I'm going to hold his book up here, which is titled "The Skyscraper in the City," which is very much the theme throughout, because that is also the title of Gail's monograph, but much broader in its kind of context and theme, called on the Woolworth Building, which is the skyscraper in the city, the Woolworth Building, and the making of modern New York. So in that book, Gail explores many aspects of, in the same way that the Wrigley Building kind of takes views and sections of the architecture of the client, the architect, the client relationship, the consumer culture, and Gail's, which was also her dissertation, is very much a serious study that tries to contextualize the Wrigley Building in the kind of litany and legacy of New York architecture, in the client and architect's relationship, but especially in the consumer culture, which is created in very importantly by F.W. Woolworth himself. So like Gail, our other respondent representing Chicago and the long history of the Chicago skyscraper in 2 volumes. We talked about this last night because Thomas Leslie is a frequent lecturer here, and we had his 2 books over on the side, the Chicago skyscraper, in 2 parts, from 1871 to 1934, and then from 1934 to 1986, and we'll wait for the 3rd volume for another
for a long time.
So, but Tom, in every way, has contextualized the skyscraper in architecture, engineering, culture, but also city planning, race, the social dimension. So we could have no better people to respond to a book that is a kind of tapestry of these various themes of people who have spent entire careers looking so closely but also thinking so broadly about particular buildings in their urban context. So Gail is going to start off with a few slides and questions, then Tom, whenever he feels so inclined, is going to chime in.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you for that introduction. You really situated the scholarship, coming from Chicago and New York beautifully. I sensed their kind of mention of Wrigley instead of Woolworth, but that doesn't surprise me because there's so many parallels between these 2 skyscrapers. And that's what I really found fascinating when I was reading this wonderful book. Beautiful photographs, and it's just, I discovered at the College Art Association conference in February, and I was just kind of bowled over by it. It was, just picking it up, and it's been a pleasure to read. And I understood that what I am to do is to kind of initiate a discussion about the Woolworth building in New York as compared to the Wrigley building in Chicago. It's fascinating for me to do because there are strong parallels between not only these two buildings, but the two cities. And so I'd like to start off, and please feel free to ask questions. And I know that Tom is going to chime in. I'm not, again, kind of leading a discussion, but I'd like to start off with showing you a little bit about each of these skyscrapers in their respective contexts. Now, you've already seen this view on the left. The view on the right, there's versions of it in the book. And it's interesting to me, whether it's a postcard and a photograph, or it's a kind of poster-like treatment of the building. They're looking for tenants there on the right, and they're trying to tell you, the owner's William Wrigley, what a wonderful office building this will be, how many different features it has that are attractive to tenants. That both of these show this building as a monument, completely freestanding as a monument. You wouldn't know, of course, the city is screened out, but there's nothing around it. It's been mentioned already by our authors that Charles Beersman was a kind of really skilled Beaux-Arts architect. And Beaux-Arts architecture is more about method than just about style. It's about composition. And you think in terms of a building that is a monument, that is a freestanding composition. That's just the way these Beaux-Arts architects actually think. So I wanted to highlight the fact that project, the creation of the Woolworth building, was one in which you have this exquisite monument, but it's in this particular setting. And I thought it important to kind of show what Chicago looked like prior to the design of the Wrigley building. And so we have a waterfront view of 1912. And you can see Daniel Burnham, as has been mentioned, very much influenced the design of the city, the future of the city with the Chicago plan of 1909 in particular. And this, I think, encouraged this height limitation of around 200 feet right around 1912. There are many different height restrictions throughout the history leading up to the Wrigley building, but right around 1912, what we're seeing here is around 200 feet. And what you see are these blocky buildings, and I know Carol Wills is in her book, Foreign Policy Finance, explains brilliantly that this skyline has a particular character that comes from these even cornice lines, that height restriction that is a powerful influence on the shape of the city. And in a conversation with Tom just a minute ago, he spoke about how the Wrigley Tower broke through that and initiated something entirely new. And what happens is you have, here it is, the freestanding monument. You see it here adjacent to Michigan Avenue Bridge. Across from that, just a couple years later, the Chicago Tribune Tower is initiated. So you see these two buildings starting something new. And I think it's important. The reason I pulled out these slides is not only to show the first, the south tower of the Wrigley building, the first part of the Wrigley building standing free in that factory district. It's just, and it's white, it just really stands out. It's there, it has a monumental presence, but it's also got that connection with the Michigan Avenue Bridge. And this, our authors too, explain the importance of this. And so it's at a site where it's highly visible. And I think Wrigley just kind of intuitively understood this in the same way that Frank Woolworth would. It can be seen, and you cross that bridge. And the view on the right shows how in crossing that bridge, you go to North Michigan Avenue, and you just kind of continue onward. And this is a new part of Chicago, and it will be developed in the way that you guys explained, with radio and music and artists, and it would be just a wonderful, and office uses as well, the Chicago Tribune media, part of Chicago. But it's that Michigan Avenue Bridge and the line of Michigan Avenue that sets a kind of datum for what happens here. And with this plaza as well, I also wanted to point that out, the public space of that plaza. This is important for seeing how these buildings and what happened here in Chicago aligns with what happened in New York with the Woolworth building. And then I have here a comparative slide showing the Chicago skyline circa 1930. So the Wrigley Tower there on the far right breaks through. And then within a decade, you have a city of towers. The Wrigley Tower initiated a kind of conversation. And Tom, would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Because you explained it so well to me.
The Chicago is the kind of dry goods boxes, right? That's the way all you New Yorkers talk about our buildings in the late 19th century. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that our soil is terrible. And so if you build a tower that weighs a lot more than the rest of the building, and the building starts to capsize. That gets overcome with caissons in 1895, so there's no reason not to build a tower. But no one has complained about the city code up until then. And it's not until really post-World War I, when development sort of takes off, that developers start to ask about this 200 or 240, whatever, the height limit changes, but to start to ask whether they can go above the kind of standard height limit. And there is an exception for a spire, meaning a church spire. And the Montgomery Ward building, which was just sort of visible in the slide a little bit ago, gets away with building a kind of big pyramid top and saying there's a spire. We're not a church, but it's just a spire. The tower at Wrigley is really important because in the Burnham drawing that you all showed, it shows Michigan Avenue being straight, right? And in fact, North Michigan Avenue is 65 feet further east than Michigan Avenue south of the river. It was originally Pine Street, a quiet residential street. And when the bridge is built, it's built on a skew. And so not only do you see the building from the plaza, right? This is one iconic view that's taken from about where the Chicago Architecture Center is today. But the other iconic view, and I think it's the one that's on the cover, is right up Michigan Avenue. For a mile south on Michigan Avenue, the tower of the Wrigley Building is placed precisely so that it's on axis. And so it's the most visible building basically in the city, because anywhere on South Michigan Avenue, you're aligned with it and you see it. The code had changed a little bit in 1920. You could have a tower up to 400 feet. The Wrigley Tower, I think, is exactly 400
It's
feet.
just a few feet short of that.
But it wasn't clear whether you could occupy that space or not. And so the story you hear is that they shelled out the space and sort of waited and see if they could get away with it, and then started moving offices and things into it afterward. And Wrigley was kind of the one to sort of pierce that 260-foot level. The other interesting thing is that the zoning code then changes. The Methodists built a 555-foot skyscraper in the Loop and say, well, it's a church, right? It's just a spire. There's 22 floors of offices in between, and finally, City Council comes back and passes the setback code, basically the New York code. And the interesting thing is Michigan Avenue Bridge opens in about 1921, 1922. The zoning code gets passed in 1922. And suddenly the Wrigley Building is not alone, right? All of these projects get built right around it. Tribune Tower, 333 Michigan, the Jewelers Building, Mathert Tower. And all of them.
I'm going to jump ahead to those.
Okay, great, yeah. So here, and you can see that the spires all stick up, and the sort of classic formula here is Strauss.
Yeah, Strauss is right there.
So you still have the.
That's Charles Beersman.
That's
Yeah,
Beersman?
Beersman's building. Yeah.
So you have that 265-foot cornice line, and then within the setback, you have the tower sticking up above it. And all of the buildings around the Michigan Avenue Bridge, except Equitable, which was post-war, are variations on that theme. So I like to take students around and just say, trace your eyeballs around the 265-foot cornice, and then look at all the different ways that architects have interpreted that setback code.
It's very interesting though to see this skyline, because you see some continuity in those lower blocks still, but then the towers are perched above. And I know Carol in her work on this, made it very clear the distinction was that in Chicago you have that block. You can have the setback. That's another iteration or another version of the code. But you see these kind of, wonderful towers like the Jewelers Building or the Carbon and Carbide Building. Willoughby, where you have these very slender towers perched on top of these lower blocks, and that's very distinctive. I do have to say about this view, the lower view it is an artist's view. It's a kind of, I think an artist has kind of gone over a photograph because the heights of the towers are exaggerated. You probably noticed that, and I think the Wrigley should maybe be a little taller than it was. But I also wanted to say that with the Chicago Tribune, it really did, and I guess I mentioned it already, create a gate to Michigan, a kind of gate to Michigan Avenue, North Michigan Avenue. And the Tribune was built right after the Wrigley, 1923 to 25. I pulled this out on the Woolworth building because it just came out of this lovely tourist brochure called Above the Clouds in Old New York. And this is the kind of thing that you saw, you know, sort of like with the Wrigley Building, you see in postcards, that building is standing free. It's this Beaux-Art idea of a monument, and somehow the advertisers and the people, you know, who create the tourist literature pick up on this. And so, you know, Gilbert is really seeing this building as designed in the round. It's represented again and again as this freestanding monument. And, you know, Gilbert was educated like Beersman. He went to MIT in a Beaux-Art influenced curriculum. You know, it's not unlike what was taught at Penn later on. So it's just another one of those parallels. But to look at New York's skyline, you know, we just saw Chicago's, 10 years before the construction of the Wrigley. Okay, so this is New York's skyline 10 years before the construction of the Woolworth. Now, this is 10 years earlier than that Chicago view, but I wanted to show you in both cases the context in which these architects were working, you know, and what we're seeing here is something very different from what we just saw in Chicago. It is a kind of a hodgepodge of the skyline. The skyline, Montgomery Schuyler said it's individuals merged in a riot. You know, people couldn't make sense of this. It was chaotic. There was no sense of agreement about how the city should look. And so it's kind of a very different scenario from what we're seeing in Chicago. And you see the effort, I think here in the lower view, there's the American Surety Building to design a skyscraper to be seen in the round like a campanile. And then kind of further to the right, the Twin Towers of the Park Row building. These flourishes, but it just doesn't hold together as a skyline. Cass Gilbert, the architect of the Woolworth building, as I mentioned, studied in an École des Beaux-Arts influenced curriculum, just like Charles Beersman. And so he has in mind, and with the École des Beaux-Arts, this idea of method as opposed to style, thinking about a composition is very important. Another idea is character. It's very, very important. And so Gilbert, in designing his West Street building 10 years prior to the Woolworth, designed a skyscraper with a tower, and it's got a clock, interestingly. And then, in thinking of this, he's got verticals. He's inspired by Louis Sullivan with those verticals. But he is aiming to create a kind of character for New York as a towered city. And he's inspired by Bruges. He's traveled to Bruges, by Flanders, which is a leading center of trade in the late Middle Ages. And he thinks New York is not unlike Bruges, and that we can kind of create a character for that city if we think, or for New York, for the New York skyline, if we think in terms of towers. The client could not afford to build the tower for the West Street building, so you see it here in the lower view, just to the right of the Singer Tower, which is by Ernest Flagg. Ernest Flagg, educated at the École des Beaux-Arts. He received a diploma. This is a very serious, educated in France, Beaux-Arts architect. And he was in the throes of the discussions over zoning legislation in New York City. How are we going to, first of all, it was height restrictions. That wasn't going to work. That just, 3 times the proposals failed to implement a height restriction. So now the conversation is turned to, influenced by École des Beaux-Arts thinking, how do we compose the skyline? And so Flagg is thinking, why not these lower blocks, that hold the cornice line like we see in Paris, like we just saw in Chicago. And above that, over part of the site, it could be 25% of the site. We have a tower that can be built as high as you would like. And this had a great influence over the zoning resolution of 1916. We combine that with setbacks, but the idea of the tower was really critical. And that was the influence for the most part of Ernest Flagg. He proposed New York as a city of towers. He called it a city of towers. So between Flagg and Gilbert, there's this idea developed, not legislated yet, that New York will be a city of towers. And that's the way we create a distinctive skyline. That's the way we call out the importance of New York as a center of trade, as the leading import-export center in the world. In designing the Woolworth building, Gilbert now got his chance to create a building with a tower structure. He said it was something like a city hall. A French hotel de ville. He very much appreciated those Flanders public buildings, Flemish city halls, town halls like Middelburg was one of his favorite, Oudenaarde was another. And so he was going to put this giant sort of, sure, it's the headquarters of the Woolworth commercial enterprise, but he's on City Hall Park. He wants to create kind of a sense of civic dignity to respond to that particular site. So he sees this as a giant hotel de ville, kind of giant city hall, but it is indeed Gothic. It's on the axis of Broadway, not unlike that axis of Michigan Avenue. Broadway just defines that axis, and your eye follows Broadway all the way down to the United States Custom House, another Cass Gilbert building, and the waterfront beyond. If you look at the view on the right, it's viewed from City Hall Park. City Hall Park is the major civic, public, open space in Lower Manhattan. The historic City Hall, 1810 is there. It's a precious building. I'm sorry, it doesn't show on these views. It's right there. It's a very distinctive public space. And so Gilbert is acknowledging that in a sense with the composition, and he is acknowledging that public open space, not unlike what we saw with Beersman and that plaza at Michigan Avenue. So in both cases, these public open spaces allow people to see this building. Nobody understood that better than Frank Woolworth. He deliberately chose the site. He called it a giant signboard for its visibility from the Brooklyn Bridge. But I also, so I'm not sure the thought process of Wrigley. Woolworth was very clear, you know, it's quoted that I see this building as a giant signboard to advertise around the world my chain of stores. And so this is what he's done. You can view it, the Brooklyn Bridge is nearly a mile long. And it's very interesting to see, and for me to think about that Michigan Avenue Bridge Plaza, and to see the importance of that bridge, and then to see the importance of the bridge here. And it's recognized by city planners, you know, that this bridge and the Woolworth, here are important in this city and how we understand the city. Here it's flanked with the municipal building. And these two buildings are functioning now with their great height, the Woolworth nearly 800 feet, like a gate, sort of like the Chicago Tribune and the Wrigley buildings, with this mile-long bridge going into the city. By this time in New York City, you know, sure enough in Chicago, the plan of Chicago is still strongly influential, but right about this time, they're giving up making it a city beautiful. They've already kind of thrown in the towel. I mean, there's lots of discussion, you know, about making City Hall Park, you know, the kind of civic center it should be and so forth. And the planners see this, Gilbert sees it. Gilbert says, city beautiful is just not practical. Let's make New York a city majestic. And so this represents, I think, in as many, this idea of the city majestic as a modern city.
It's interesting, again, if you go back one slide, both of these buildings are never seen on axis, right? They're both always seen. I mean, today we
see Wrigley and Woolworth.
Yeah. Today we see Woolworth on axis because this is no longer there.
Yeah.
But
and it was there until 1930.
Yeah, but looking at the image, you can see that Gilbert understood that Woolworth was always going to be seen diagonally, right? And Wrigley is very much you're never standing face on with it, right? So they're both, to me, like, yes, they're Beaux-Arts, yes, they're Gothic, but they're also picturesque, in that they both feel like they're composed in perspective instead of like straight on.
And I think, you know, that picturesque element is very important for the distant views, for the skyline views. You know, the flat cornice line just doesn't make sense in the skyline views. I mean, in terms of the kind of the beauty of the city, at least as Cass Gilbert saw it, he really did want to make this skyline picturesque. And if we look at this view of 1915, not unlike what we just saw of Chicago's waterfront, this a little bit earlier, you can see that there is a kind of order that's brought to the skyline with these towers that are, you know, relatively by accident, you know, because it's just, you know, whatever, it's individual speculators doing whatever they like. But nonetheless, we see a kind of order and dignity being brought to the skyline by this idea of a city of towers. These views, I think, are interesting because they show that the sketch of Cass Gilbert's at the top, and then below that of Joseph Pennell, a noted kind of etcher, numerous views of New York City. But in both cases, they're both exaggerating the height of the Woolworth building. They're exaggerating the height. They're playing down the buildings around it. They're making it look like a monument, like it's at the very center of the scene. And even Joseph Pennell, you know, who, by the way, studied as an architect, you know, he's kind of appreciating that idea of the kind of monumental skyscraper and how it might structure the city. And again, the reason I pulled these out was because of the Wrigley Building. The Wrigley Building is just so prominent, you know, in its location within Chicago. But, you know, here by contrast, today, we see that there are a number of buildings that have grown up around the Woolworth, you know, so it just doesn't have the power, the iconicity, you know, or whatever you want to describe that as an icon, that the Wrigley Building does. I mean, it still does, but it's not quite the same thing. So I hope I've given you just a sense of how we can kind of understand these buildings comparatively in relation to their respective cities at the time they were built. And now I just want to show you some themes that they share in common, which I thought was really interesting. And I actually had a list of 10 of these. I mean, and I know we don't have time for that. And also I told Carol and Tom that we have a time limitation, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I think it's just mostly to show you images that to me evoke kind of continuities, kind of correspondences between these two buildings. So we've already heard about the lighting. I don't think we've seen that postcard, which really shows the Wrigley Building brilliantly lit, you know, against this kind of black sky. On the right, very elaborate kind of treatment of how one exactly place these lamps with reflectors. And Tom and I, or maybe I was talking to either one of you about just the front of that building being really brilliantly lit, calling attention to its monumentality. And even here in 1930, this is you know, a kind of special kind of celebration of the Lindbergh beacon, which you see in the back, being shown at the top of the Palmolive building for the first time in 1930. To celebrate Lindbergh, who crossed the Atlantic in 1927. But nonetheless, the Wrigley Building, it's white and it's floodlit. And even those other very prominent towers are kind of receding in this view. And it's not about the Wrigley Building, it's about the beacon, right? But the Wrigley is so, you know, such a distinctive design, I think, that it really, and so beautifully floodlit, it stands at the center. Very briefly, Frank Woolworth is very proud that his tower was the first use of floodlighting on a work of architecture. And he inaugurated that tower as floodlit at night in 1915. So it's very bright, contemporary. I can never call it a shaft of alabaster against the darkness or blackness of the night. 550 automobile lamps with reflectors on the building alone, sending the light shooting up to the tower, and then other reflectors and lamps downward to create this uniformly lit surface on all sides. So that's 1915, the very first time that we see this. And I'm just going to, here we see it from a distance. City signature terracotta towers. You have so beautifully described this terracotta. And I have to say that with the Woolworth building, and you've described it so well, I'm not even going to attempt that. I'm going to just show a view of the terracotta factory where this was produced. Tom, you are an expert on these materials. You may want to say a few words.
Well, we've also got like experts in the audience too, but I will say that the two go hand in hand, right? The white terracotta is naturally brick colored. And so the Wrigley Building and all of the kind of white terracotta buildings that you see are enamel terracotta. So it has a porcelain coating that's baked onto the sort of terracotta piece. And that makes it water resistant. I wouldn't say waterproof, but it also gives it this very specular surface. And if you think about how do you floodlight a building, like first you want the building to be shiny, right? So this is an ideal material for it. And enamel terracotta is something that Northwestern terracotta doesn't necessarily invent, but they kind of perfect. So it is a little bit of a local material. But also, like, just to go back to the idea of lighting, like you need efficient lights, which only really happen in around 1910 when we get tungsten filaments instead of carbon. And you need your neighbors to agree to put floodlights on their roof. In the case of Woolworth,
Nothing on neighboring roofs.
Nothing on neighboring roofs. That's amazing because the evenness is something that you only get if you very carefully place the floodlights. Wrigley, a lot of it today, and I assume when it was opened, is actually floodlit from across the river. And it's only so even because they have that wide open space in front of it to illuminate it. But the terracotta is absolutely a piece of it because the enamel, the white that's baked on it's not terracotta's natural color, obviously. And that porcelain that's on the outside is crucial to getting the kind of alabaster shine from it.
So the Woolworth building, all terracotta. And it's Atlantic Terracotta Company in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. It's just across the Hudson River. And it's interesting to compare these two designs. I was feeling, after I was listening to you describe all of the iconography and the details and what this represented at the Wrigley Building. And then I thought, well, you look at the Woolworth building, it's got flamboyant Gothic detail. It's done very well. It's derived from a number of sources. Cass Gilbert said he chose flamboyant because of flame, and terracotta was a fire, to connect it with terracotta is a process of firing and so on. But I think what's interesting, in a comparative analysis is how Cass Gilbert used color. He was a huge admirer of Ruskin. He was an admirer of John Ruskin, the Victorian critic, the idea of constructional polychromy, that's color contained within the construction. Of course, the Victorians were thinking of brick and limestone and red and beige and so on. And he knew he couldn't really do that with terracotta, but he wanted to create some of the same effect. And so he was using lots of colors. And you see here on the left, just beneath these canopies, a kind of dark bronze green that he's using in the transoms. And he's doing that because he wants to create, he said, a sense of cavernous recess beneath these kind of projecting canopies within the crown. And so he's literally using color to create a sense of depth in this building. I mean, that's one of his aims. And he's very skilled. And on the underside of the canopy, he has really dark blue, but he's got little stars of gold, that catch the sunlight. And then across the building in different places, he's using yellows, light greens, light blues, dark blues. It's a range of color. If you move down the stories a little bit further, you can see there's buff tones in the transoms. That's just to make the transoms recede against what Gilbert called the light lines and planes of the piers. You can see here on the right, there's some yellow. He said he used that color in the background of the tracery so that your eyes would see the lines of the tracery. He really wanted to call attention to the character, to the linear quality of that tracery. He's got copper roofs. He's got gilding on the roofs as well. And so he's very skilled, very sensitive in his handling of color. And it's interestingly, by comparison to the Wrigley, what he said about the glaze was that it was to be matte glaze because he wanted it to have the look of age. So he didn't want that sheen. He also said that he was using many colors of ivory and cream. I wouldn't call it modeled, but you can see that there's a variation in the color as you look across the elevation, especially when you look at the elements, the transom elements that recede. So it doesn't have that complexity of iconography, but I need to add that I'm not showing the Woolworth's interior. I haven't shown the details of the exterior where he has W's written in, W's are part of the terracotta. Along the base of the building, there's representation of, the continents in world trade, really important. Jean Ago, Jacques Dieppe, these are two merchants from the Middle Ages, sculptures to be flanking the entrance. So the iconography is there, but just not to the level that we see in the Wrigley. The other thing I thought was interesting to point out is that, the Wrigley is nearly 400 feet tall. This is nearly 800 feet. So it's about twice as high. And so again, following John Ruskin, Ruskin said, when you're at the upper stories of any building, the ornament should be colossal so that it can be read from the street. So Gilbert took that to heart, and his aim was with the terracotta with these crockets and pinnacles at the top with the terrelles. And you can see them way up there. We're really close to the roof of the building. That he wanted people at the street, from the street, to be able to see that ornament. And Montgomery Schuyler, that very perceptive critic, said, no, this is no mere process of monstrification. That's not what's going on. He's very careful about how he's calibrating that ornament so that wherever you are, it's interesting to the spectator. And it humanizes the building by bringing it down to the street, down to the human scale. You feel you can connect with that detail, even from a great distance. not unlike what we just heard from Tom about the Northwestern Terracotta Works. But there's a difference here, I think I want to point out, and maybe it was true of Northwestern as well. Right around the time of the Woolworth Building contract, it was one of the largest contracts for terracotta ever, historically the largest. And you can see on the left an advertisement for Atlantic Terracotta. Perth Amboy Works, as I mentioned, are just across the Hudson River. But at the time of the Woolworth Building, just before the Woolworth Building was designed, they had merged with 3 other large terracotta companies, one of them the Perth Amboy Company, that was the name of it. And they're very large and they're producing lots of terracotta. There's lots of office buildings, and I'll ask Susan Tunick to weigh in if she would like, but I'll just say that importantly and interestingly, they had inspectors now at the Terracotta Works trying to speed up the process of production. They're standardizing production. They're trying to, they're mechanizing it to the extent that they can. Interestingly, at the Woolworth Building project, the terracotta is being hauled in by trucks drawn by horses really continuously over a period of about 5 months. And then suddenly it just stops. Most of the building is sheathed in terracotta. Nothing happens for 2 months. And it's because the sculptural pieces and the canopies and the finials had to be made by hand. They just had to be made by hand. And there's this mention of this man, Fritz, yeah, who really was the artist at the Northwestern Works. Here it was Elizio Ricci, who had studied as a sculptor in Florence. And then so he would okay everything that that was modeled by hand. Otherwise it wouldn't go out of the Atlantic Terracotta Works.
What's the lower postcard or image?
That view, I believe it's Perth Amboy, and I think it's further up the river. I don't have an identification for it, unfortunately, but it is called Perth Amboy, and I think it might be the Perth Amboy Works. But Susan, you may have seen something I haven't.
No, I haven't seen it. That's so interesting.
I don't know how much time we have this, but I found this fascinating. I just found that the Wrigley Building was where this arts club was.
Yes.
And as soon as I read that, I thought, wow, the Woolworth Building, one of my kind of more recent interests at the Woolworth Building is that it was really, really fascinating for the artists around Stieglitz, the Stieglitz Circle in New York. And these are avant-gardes. And so this is what we're seeing here as well. Rue Carpenter is interested in promoting modern art. It's fascinating. She chooses the Wrigley Building as a place to promote modern art. And she has this, she one-man shows,
Guernica was shown.
Guernica was there, absolutely, Picasso and some of the other artists, noted modern artists.
Oh, all of them.
Brancusi, of course.
Yeah. Modigliani, Leger, they all showed at the Wrigley Building. This is at a time when they were barred from mainstream museums.
And this is kind of like Stieglitz, there's 291 Gallery,
Yes.
right around 1910, the Eve of the Army show in New York. And it's Stieglitz a little bit earlier here, but it's interesting that these two tall, Beaux-Arts buildings are so interesting. I'll get to the Woolworth in a minute. But here we have, Ruth Carpenter, she's the president of the Arts Club. They're in the North Tower to start with, and she holds this Brancusi exhibition. And in New York, we have Alfred Stieglitz, who is fascinated with the skyscraper. He studied mechanical engineering in Berlin before he studied photography. And he said what appealed to him about the Flatiron was the lightness of its construction. This is one of the reasons he was drawn to the Flatiron. And what we see here is what some art historians judge as the really first truly avant-garde photograph. And we see it coming from Stieglitz, and we see this building shown as a lightweight plane in space. It's remarkable. By 1910, his interest had shifted downtown, and he is photographing skyscrapers in the vicinity of the financial district downtown. This is his city of ambition, one of them. And then he sees the Woolworth, and he said, once I saw the Woolworth shooting up into the sky, the Flatiron no longer held my interest. I thought, that's Alfred Stieglitz. That's very interesting. And interestingly, he did not take a photograph of the Woolworth. But what happened instead was the artist of his circles, and these are two of his most important artists, Alvin Langdon Coburn from Boston. He called him the youngest star. And so Coburn goes down to, to the financial district, and there are a number of views of buildings that he is shooting from high angles, because he'd just gone to Yosemite and he'd gone to Grand Canyon, and he comes back with remarkable photographs. And so he's seeing Lower Manhattan as a kind of a mountainous topography. Here he is at the Singer Building, looking towards the Woolworth, rising out of these plumes of smoke. And again, even with the avant-gardes, this thing is standing free. It's a monument, so it's just not the advertisers. It's, it's somebody like an Alvin Langdon Coburn seeing it this way. And at this time, he's showing his photographs in London with the linked ring, and it's a symbol of circle. And, there's this belief of the relationship between the material and the transcendent world. And I think some of this is coming through in this photograph. On the right, same year, John Marin. Another, first one-man show at Stieglitz's 291, it's 291 Fifth Avenue. The Armory show is going to happen the next year. But here's Marin, a remarkable artist, inspired by the energies of New York. He says, I feel, he's trained as an architect as well, combined with Pennell and the others. And these buildings move me. These buildings move me. So they must too have life. And he's trying to show the life of this building, the energy of the building, surrounded by the constant state of, he had been in Europe for a long time, and he's just overwhelmed by the dynamism of the city. He's trying to show that. But most importantly, I think coming out of Stieglitz's circle, again, are Charles Sheeler and Paul Strand. They met in the late teens. Sheeler was from Philadelphia, and they got together and said, let's look at moving images, not just a still image. And it's 5 blocks in Lower Manhattan. They're on top of the Equitable Building. They go to the top of the Liberty Tower, the Singer Building, the Park Row. They're shooting downward, and they're creating a wholly new aesthetic where buildings collide and collapse into one another, collapse into space, seemingly collapsing into time. This is Coburn's interest. It's the first avant-garde film in the world. It's phenomenal. I'm just showing you stills. I wish I could show the entire film. We don't have time for it. The other interesting theme, I'm watching the time. I'm just going to skip through this. This is advertising. We've seen that. We know what it is. Just want to say about Woolworth. He used the building. By contrast to Wrigley, it was everywhere, everywhere. It's a trademark. He takes the building, makes it a trademark. It's on his commodities. He said, I am not going to invest in billboards. I'm not, even though like the building is a giant signboard, not going to invest in print advertising. I don't want to bother with all that. The best advertisements are the commodities themselves, which are on the counters. Oh, by the way, they've got a little trademark Woolworth building on them as well. It's very sophisticated. The building is not even starting construction. And here he gets Houston Hawley's rendering of Cass Gilbert's design. He copyrights it, copyright by F.W. Woolworth. He announces, Carol Willis said he could have possibly done this, but he tried anyway, to the New York papers, like all 5 of them, publish it in your Sunday editions, and so there's Hawley's drawing. And then he creates a postcard of his own to kind of further market. And he's doing all this, right? And the building is not even, it's just barely being constructed there when it gets announced in the New York Times. A man named Hugh McAdamy comes to Woolworth. He said, he's so impressed with Woolworth's publicizing of the building. Can he help? So Woolworth names him director of advertising. He advertises the construction. He develops the promotion for the opening. He thinks of countless ways to promote this building, Hugh McAdamy. He helps Woolworth make it into a spectacular site for tourists. 100,000 people per year from 60 different countries shortly after it's opened. It's really a spectacle for tourists. The postcards are part of this. There's a whole tourist literature developed around it, several publications. And I'm just watching the time. I'm just going to stop right here. I do want to end, show you John Marin's spectacular view from the top of the Woolworth. Not at all. Stieglitz Circle detests that tourist literature. They detest it. It's this colorful, sugar-coated, we don't want to do anything, have anything to do with it. And Marin said, this is the reality of from the top, you can go to the top and see the reality of the experience, the dynamism of New York, the electric light, the high-speed transportation, the circulation of commodities, all of it from the top of the Woolworth Building.
Donald Penn is going to talk a little bit about his new book, The Skyscraper in the City.
Thanks. I'll start off, as I start off in the book, with a very brief comment or two about the history. I think it was number 28 that you showed. This is number 31 in the series. Artists working in oil paint have tended to depict skyscrapers with hard, straight verticals. The history of depicting skyscrapers in watercolor is rather different. Watercolor itself tends to be thought of as a more delicate medium. And there are some wonderful examples, we'll get to one in a second, of skyscrapers painted in that way. But the one very well-known watercolorist from this period who painted skyscrapers is of course very different. John Marin painted skyscrapers in a wild way, wonderfully refreshing, I think. And he stayed away from hard, straight verticals. I'll just give one brief quote of John Marin about skyscrapers and buildings. Buildings, people, all are alive. And the more they move, the more they move me, the more I feel them to be alive. So very much a subjective thing, perceiving the skyscraper in the city. And I feel very much the same thing, I guess. But let me show you also, sorry, what do I do this? What do I have to, oh, just, anyway, okay, great. Show you also a very different sort of watercolor of the Woolworth Building again. This is by Rachel Robinson Elmer, who did a wonderful series. I don't know if you know her images. They were put out in postcards, watercolors reproduced in postcards. And I don't know anyone who's painted skyscrapers in watercolor better in a traditional watercolor style. So delicate, realistic, with a consistent light source than Rachel Robinson Elmer. This sort of style is the way I always tried to paint without a great deal of success, certainly far worse than Rachel Robinson Elmer, until one moment in 94, I guess it was 31 years ago. I'll just quote briefly here from the book. I was outside Chicago for some meetings. I had a few hours before I had to catch a flight back. This is the first time I'd seen Chicago. I drove into the city with my rental car, found my way to a parking lot at Lake and Canal overlooking the Chicago River. I was astonished. I was swept away by the river, by the bridges, by the dramatic sky, but most of all, by the extraordinary concentration of stunning architecture. From the enormity of the Merchandise Mart to the left, to the wonderful curves of 333 Wacker Drive just across the river, to the pencil thin 75 East Wacker Drive. Mather or Mather Tower, somebody probably knows. I only had time to do a quick sketch, but this is the painting that I worked up from that later, and it's it changed my approach to painting generally, and certainly to painting cities and skyscrapers. I'll show you several others of Chicago. You may not recognize the Wrigley Building to the left, but the clock is sort of visible. I'm not sure. The Jewelers Building. One time I got stuck in there's a round elevator at the top of the Jewelers Building. Some of you may know that. I got stuck in that elevator with a UPS guy at one point. We thought I'd be there overnight, but moving right along, more Chicago. The one in the middle here, I gather they changed the name from Big Red to The Red. Anyway, more Chicago skyscraper. You can see the Sears Tower there, of course. This is not a skyscraper. This is the park that was known as Cubs Park, renamed in 1927. And I'm sure you all know the name of it now in Chicago. Sears Tower, you can see the, to try to convey the life of skyscrapers, buildings generally, I've often put dots that are irregularly arranged for the windows to try to get a sense of shimmer, a sense of them being alive. I hope you get some sense of that there. A few of New York, Empire State Building. You can't really make it. The Chryslers there too, and of course the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. This was the date of this 1998. They hadn't put in the Chelsea, the fancy shopping stuff and everything, but there were ruined piers there, as you can see. The Jersey Shore and the Statue of Liberty just visible on the other side. 1999. This one is from the Twin Towers. Those are the only two times I've painted the Twin Towers, and both times I used much straighter verticals than I hardly ever use. I'm not sure why. And both times the top of the buildings, the top of the Twin Towers sort of melt into the sky. Again, I'm not sure why I did them that way. More baseball, Shea Stadium with the Plains, Midtown skyscrapers to the left as of 2005. The Manhattan Bridge is just visible. It's such a lovely view. I don't know if you've walked across the Manhattan Bridge ever, but it's such a gorgeous view of the Brooklyn Bridge, of the downtown. So many different skyscrapers now than there were in 2006. I'll finish with just a few quick images of other American cities. Minneapolis. There's a wonderful story behind the Fauché Tower, the one at an angle there in the middle. Wilbur Fauché wanting to, as a child, wanting when he grew up to become a business leader and to make a building that was like the Washington Monument. That's the Fauché Tower. Denver, one of my wilder ones. I don't remember much about any of these buildings. Milwaukee, I love Milwaukee. This may not be one of my strongest paintings, but I often move buildings around. The Miller Park I have here for the baseball, it's not there, it's somewhere down over there. How did people break in there? Phoenix, 2016. I was there for a conference November 3rd to 6th, 2016. And I added the dark cloud in the distance. You can see down that street, there's a dark cloud in the distance. 2016, November 8th was election day that year. Dark cloud was Trump. The Roberto Clemente Bridge in Pittsburgh. Again, there is baseball here at PNC Park, and the sort of a little misplaced. I often put skyscrapers that I'm fond of. I give them more prominence. In my Cleveland pictures, I give the terminal building much more prominence than it should have. Terminal Tower. In this case, the Gulf Tower is not quite placed there, and certainly not so prominent as it is right in the center of that painting. Columbus, the last 10 or 15 years, I think gradually I've moved maybe a little away from the wildness of John Marin and more towards Rachel Robinson Elmer. I don't know, maybe we get less wild as we get old. That's Columbus. Again, I've moved lots of buildings around. The 1897 Wyandotte building, Daniel Burnham, is made visible there. And the 1927 Levesque Tower.
Last one is Miami Beach. Some South Beach stuff. The Greystone Hotel with a pool on top. I love that. And the Shelburne Hotel, recently renovated, I gather. That's just a taste. Of course, I hope you will. Your appetite will be whetted, and you may want more. Copies are for sale here. It's on Amazon, $29.95. What else can I say? It's not as there are 3 books called The Skyscraper in the City. This one has no subtitle. It's not as good as Gale's. But it's pretty good. Maybe a lot more.
We've all been here for a very long time, but let me just say that, we're all here because we love cities, and I think we love skyscrapers too. I think that's been demonstrated by everybody here today, that the city is an inspiration on every level, I think. And the skyscrapers are the kings and queens of the city. There are aristocracy, there are aspiration, they are symbols in a lot of different ways. From every perspective that we discussed it today, there was nothing but love and enthusiasm for these buildings. So it warmed my heart very much that you're all here to celebrate. And so thank you all for coming and for sitting through and attending to with all of the kind of focus and dedication to a subject which I think we all find endlessly interesting. So thanks so much for coming.